Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, it's usually the centrepiece of the political year, but today's state opening of Parliament seemed more like a sideshow ahead of the looming and politically dominant EU referendum. A slimline Queen's speech lasting less than 9 minutes outlined 21 pieces of legislation, including a bill giving prison governors new freedoms in how they run their own jails, new powers for hospitals to recover the costs from overseas visitors and migrants for any treatment they receive, a new tax on sugar-rich fizzy drinks to begin in April 2018, and a promise to fund the development of technology for driverless cars, drones and spaceport for commercial satellites and space tourism. But there was less clarity in 3 areas the government has promoted, promising only consultation on a British Bill of Rights and some new anti-extremism measures and only the encouragement of schools to become academies. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Right now, for the government, Europe takes precedence over everything. Even grand ceremonial occasions are pressed to the cause. The referendum poses an existential threat to David Cameron. So in today's Queen's speech, for the sake of staying in Europe, some measures were toned down, some delayed. Number 10 wanted nothing too controversial. Unveiled.
My ministers will ensure the United Kingdom is at the forefront of technology for new forms of transport, including autonomous and electric vehicles.
The promised sovereignty bill asserting the primacy of UK courts over the European Court of Justice wasn't mentioned. The Justice Secretary's promised British Bill of Rights, barely mentioned. His fellow Leave campaigner Ian Duncan Smith said it was a Queen's speech diluted to keep the Remain campaign on track.
Well, it's not the most extensive one I've ever seen, and we were elected a year ago. I can understand the government's position on this, which is they have a Queen's speech, but it's in the middle of a referendum, so they're going to have those elements that aren't directly affecting the referendum. Anything that is likely to impinge or damage the government's position or create a debate around it, such as a sovereignty bill, which was promised in February, these are to be jettisoned.
Right now, there's a parade going on outside. Aren't you, so to speak, passing water on the government's parade?
Not really, no. I love a parade as much as the next man or woman, but you know, the parade is only an expression of something, and it's an expression of the sovereignty of the British people.
In the Lords, there are screens for MPs who can't squeeze into the back of the chamber to see the Queen. They heard the government emphasising new powers for prison governors aimed at improving education and reducing reoffending. The Justice Secretary, Michael Gove, responsible for prisons, chatted to the Queen. Many think he leaked the story that the Queen had attacked the EU at a private lunch. The Sun newspaper was today wrapped over the knuckles for its front page on that story. The Queen seemed ready to move on. The Labour leader said it wasn't at all clear how many of the new bills announced by the Queen would become law, given how many times the government had caved into pressure in recent times.
On current form, Mr. Speaker, much of what Her Majesty announced today will not require her signature.
We are building a greater Britain again, with a sound economy, strong defences and opportunity for all. These are the actions of a progressive, one-nation Conservative government, and I commend this speech to the House.
There are quite a number of other major pieces of legislation which impact largely on England and Wales. They relate to education, to adoption, to reforms, to democratic processes. So when the Prime Minister talks about this being a one-nation Queen's speech, we on these benches know which nation he's talking about.
Amongst the 21 bills, a right to broadband, extra powers for the security services. But the Queen announced some bills with very broad catch-all titles, which some think could be filled up with big measures after the referendum, if the Prime Minister has won and has the authority to act.
My sense looking at the Queen's speech is the government's left its options open for the future. It's put into the Queen's speech lots of really wide-ranging measures, such as a lifetime savings bill, an education for all bill, a better markets bill, and they're bills that have a very wide scope, which means that the government can infill them with policy later on.
That depends on next month's vote and whether David Cameron still serves as the 12th Prime Minister of her reign.
Gary Gibbon reporting. Well, we're joined now by the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Liz Truss. Liz Truss, perhaps I could start with a rather unusual question, which is the words of Ian Duncan Smith today. Many Conservatives have become increasingly concerned that in the government's helter-skelter pursuit of the referendum, they've been jettisoning or watering down key elements of their legislative programme. That's exactly what the Queen's speech looks like today, isn't it?
I disagree with that. I think that this is a reforming Queen's speech that has many elements dealing with the fundamental problems we face as a country: low productivity, with the second lowest productivity in the G7, and poor social mobility. And this is about reforming our economy and helping people get on in life. So we've got major measures on universities, on prison reform, vital for our social reforms, but also measures on the economy like universal broadband service, modern transport, that are very important for getting our productivity levels up.
But it comes on the heels of retreats on tax credits, on disability cuts, on academies, trade union reform. I mean, things have not gone too well, and this is amid this incredibly poisonous contest over Europe.
We've also made massive progress. For example, the apprenticeship. The apprenticeship levy.
But I'm asking you about the stuff that's gone wrong.
We've got the highest levels of employment ever. We've put in reforms on childcare, bringing 30 hours a week to parents, working parents, all kinds of reforms, and this is a continuation.
Well,
so, for
the viewer will be excited by
the
that
universities
list.
Reform.
Yeah.
That is the biggest reform to universities for at least 20 years, bringing in new providers, looking at the quality of teaching,
others could argue that, that in an age when people are questioning whether so many people should go to university and whether, given the incredible debt that they incur, it's a right to expand the university sector. Surely the sector that should have been expanded is that for vocational training, which is in desperate short supply.
Well, I've said that we've just put through the apprenticeships levy, which will mean we have 3 million apprenticeships over the course of this Parliament. But we actually have fewer people going to university than many developed countries. And all the evidence is we're going to need more people with skills, whether it's STEM skills in particular, areas like engineering. This is vital for our country's productivity, and it's absolutely what this government should be focusing on. I think we're focusing on the key problems and looking at how we fix them and how we get this country more productive.
You're putting a very positive spin on it, but let's be candid. This is all about the EU referendum, which is utterly poisonous. It's only about trying to heal an unhealable breach in the Tory party. It's subjecting the country to an appalling state of affairs in which they are seeing leading politicians just attacking each other from A to Z.
Well, first of all, there are over 20 bills in this Queen's speech,
I asked you about the referendum poison.
I've outlined some of the really important measures. I think the prison reforms are also extremely important.
With respect, you have said that already. Let's be candid.
I don't think I did talk about prison reform.
But you're somebody who wants to stay in
Absolutely.
Europe. And you must be absolutely distressed about this threat. The real possibility that this country falls out because of a ludicrous decision to have a referendum at all. What was the whole idea of elective democracy but to resolve these incredibly difficult things? And instead you ask the innocent citizen to try and work it out for themselves. Go on, you work it out and then we'll deal with it.
Well, I'm proud to be part of a government that is giving people a say for the first time in 40 years. You know, I was born in the year of the last referendum. I haven't had my chance to express my views on this issue. I think it's really important that my generation are able to have their say. And we promised this in the manifesto. We're delivering on it. It's an important debate. It will be decided within a month or so. What we have outlined today is a really important legislative programme which will continue. Of course, the European issue is important, and I'm very clear that Britain is better off staying in, and that is also vital for our future productivity, our trade and our growth as a nation. So
you're a pro.
Both of those things are important.
You've got in here and made 2 really positive plugs for what you believe in, but you still haven't addressed the difficulties of the contest that's going on, but we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Steve, for joining us.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, John. Now, back to our political editor, Gary Gibbon, who's in Westminster. Gary, there you are. So, peace in our time, sort of, perhaps, between Jeremy Hunt and the junior doctors. How much has this damaged the government, this dispute?
Well, you were just hearing in an earlier interview how relations with NHS staff, trust, has been damaged. There's an inconvenience factor, probably quite a sizable one for some patients over a period of time. There's a cost to the NHS that has accumulated through this dispute, and sometimes the NHS sounds like a sort of dodgy boiler in the attic that's really making some alarming, rumbling noises. It could do without any extra cost implications. I think overall, though, the government has managed to avoid any sort of high publicity, catastrophic incident in these strikes. And so, with the temptation of political memories to be short, you can't help thinking the caravan will broadly move on.
Now, I know you're fascinated by drones and driverless cars and spaceports and things like that, but how thin was this Queen's speech really?
It was quite thin. Normally, a Queen's speech announcement of a huge legislative programme, it goes into the government's grid, its schedule of announcements, covering about 2 or 3 days, something like that. Lots to say, lots to spread across the newspapers and the broadcasters. This was only in for 1 day, so you might wonder why did they do it at all today if it was such a small marker in the grid. And that's because they wanted to prove they could ride 2 horses, the main business of government and the EU referendum. The truth is they're really concentrating on just 1 horse, and that's getting through the referendum, winning it. They hope winning big. They hope big enough for David Cameron in a different speech, which you really should all look at if he wins after the referendum, when he'll try to prove he's got 3 years petrol of ideas in the tank.
Got it. Gary, thanks very much indeed.
I've been getting